My name is Peter Ivanovich Nevdashenko. I am 85 years old. My father worked at the Military Ministry of Communications in the USSR, while my mother worked at the post office. My parents had 4 children. There was my older sister, me and my twin brother, and our baby brother. We first learned about the war in 1941, when a huge fleet of German bomber jets suddenly appeared over the city of Kyiv and started dropping bombs. At first, we didn't know what was happening. We didn't know a war had started. We heard people screaming in panic. Only at 12 p.m. did we get a radio broadcast saying that the German fascist army suddenly attacked and invaded the Soviet Union. On Tuesday, my father rushed to the military recruiting station to join the assault battalions to fight against the Nazi army. We got a call requesting us at the station. My mother took me and my twin brother along with her. My father came out to meet us. He was already dressed up in the military uniform and gave us his bag filled with his civilian clothes. He said the Germans started aggressively bombing the city that night, but the Red Army had set up defenses, deploying anti-aircraft guns and launching airships to prevent German planes from aiming at important locations. He said tonight he's being taken to the assault battalion's training camp to prep for the defense and fight for the city. He spent 3 or 4 weeks there. Once his training was over, my mother took us along with her again to meet our dad, while our older sister stayed back to watch our baby brother at home. I remembered that training camp very well. There was this really weird yellow sand and the sun was shining bright. There was a huge green wall and a military checkpoint at the entrance. My father came out of the checkpoint with a green military pot in his hands. He took a spoon out of his boot and told us, "Here you go, my children. I have borscht and some bread for you from our kitchen in the camp. Make sure you finish it all." Then added, "Tonight I'm heading west to join the defense forces." Me and my brother started eating the soup 1 spoon at a time. 1 spoon for him, 1 spoon for myself. There were even pieces of meat down there we were surprised to find. The cooks at the camp must have known this might have been the last good meal for these soldiers and didn't hold back on the meat. I remembered this borscht as one of the tastiest I've ever had. A real Ukrainian red borscht. I remembered the taste for the rest of my life. Later on, when my mother would cook for me, or if I had one somewhere in a cafeteria or in school, I would always compare it to the one our father gave us. But I've never tried a borscht better than that one. This was the very last time we ever saw our father. Later on, we would receive letters from the battlefield called triangle letters, as they were shaped like triangles. In those letters, Father told us the battles were very violent, but that the Red Army was able to hold their defenses. We were able to delay the invasion by a few months. The Germans thought they would march into Kyiv without too much trouble, but our armies fought hard until they ran out of bullets. Unfortunately, the forces were still equal, and we had to give up Kyiv to the Nazis. After the war, in 1944, when Kyiv was liberated by the Red Army, we received a letter of condolence. The postman rang our doorbell. My mother opened the door. He gave her the letter, and as she was reading it, we heard her screams. Me and my brother already knew that if she would scream, that means we lost our father, because we were used to hearing screams of women in the apartment building we lived in. The letter said that our father disappeared without a trace defending our motherland. It also said that the letter served as motion for us, his children, to receive his pension. This way, he was neither dead nor alive. Me and my brother of course hoped and waited for him to come back. Since it said he disappeared without a trace, we thought he would come back. We only managed to find out when he died over 60 years later, when a book in memory of fallen soldiers was released in Ukraine. In the second volume it read, Nevdashenko Ivan Fedorovich died on the 29th of January, 1944, near the city of Vinnytsia. Hitler had one of his bunkers there, and they fought hard to take that territory back. The battalion my father served in managed to draw the Germans out, but my father ended up dying in the fight. On the 9th of May, I took a trip to the place he died with my family. We saw a sign that said there was almost 1,000 fallen soldiers buried on that site. There were several memorial stones with the names of the fallen soldiers carved into them. There were only 300 names, the rest were unknown. They carved the name of my father into one of the stones. He became the 301st on that list. We brought flowers, put them on the stones, and mourned our father for the first time in our lives. 62 years later, we found out that he died. My whole life, I wondered how and where he died and where we could find his bones. And just like that, we finally found out. My mom kept working at the post office after the Nazis entered the city. She ran back and forth, trying to balance her job and keeping an eye on us as we were just 5 years old when the war started. My sister was 15 at that time, and our younger brother was still very little, just a year old. In late September, when the Germans entered the city, the first thing we saw were their scout regiments. They rode on motorbikes with sidecars. The driver had an assault rifle hanging off his neck. Behind him was another soldier holding onto the bike with one hand and with an assault rifle of his own in the other. Another soldier sat in the sidecar that had a machine gun attached to it. They were terrified someone would attack them, as they were the first to enter the city. But they had no idea at that time that there were no Red Army soldiers left in the city. All of our soldiers were ordered to cross the river and destroy every bridge behind them. Nazi occupation was difficult from the very start. There was no government in the beginning, neither German nor Soviet. All stores had closed. People started looting, taking everything they could. Later on, when the Nazis settled in the city, they established their regime. For any disobedience or even minor violation of their rules, there was only one solution: a gunshot to the head. That's how they decided was the best way to treat peaceful civilians. Later on, stores had reopened, and they had signs on them that would say, "Store only for Germans. Citizens of Kyiv had no right to enter." Even if we wanted to enter, we wouldn't be able to buy anything since we didn't have German money. Later, the Germans introduced a currency called karbovancy that we'd be able to use in such stores, but this currency was only paid to people who worked for the Nazis. People who had no jobs working for the Germans didn't have any options to earn their money. The Nazis simply told us it's none of their problems. They only gave out jobs to reliable, strong people who they thought would not cause any trouble for them. There were many partisans hiding on the outskirts of Kyiv, soldiers and people who revolted against the German regime and tried to fight back on their own. Their primary way of communication was via bird mail. The German governor of Kyiv at that time gave out an order to exterminate every last pigeon in the city. It was already winter, and we went hungry almost every night at that time. My older sister found a piece of bread somewhere, opened the window in our apartment, and spread some crumbs around. Some birds got in to feed on those crumbs. My sister shut the window, and from there it was pretty easy to catch them. Our mother cooked a soup for us out of those pigeons. We were shocked how good it tasted. We were shocked to see drops of fat in it. We've long since forgotten what fat tasted like. In order to survive, we started hiking to nearby villages to trade our things for food. We couldn't really sell anything for money. All we could do was trade out stuff for food. We'd give the villagers random things that we owned, and in return, they would give us flour, millet, wheat, or buckwheat. Our mother would knit these rucksacks for us, and as soon as we filled them up with food, we hiked back home. We saved the food as much as possible, cooking it so it lasted as long as possible. That's how we managed to keep us simply alive throughout that entire time. When me and my brother would return from one of these hiking trips, our mother would always meet us when we got close to the city. Nazis were very suspicious of anyone passing and checked anyone entering the city. But when they saw that there was a woman with a couple of young children, they most certainly didn't bother us. Just before entering the city, they would always check what we were carrying. They would always take away eggs, chicken, or butter if anyone was carrying. But we never carried that stuff because we simply could not afford it. We could only ever get simple foods like wheat and flour, and the Germans never bothered to take that away. We also noticed that if we walked further away from the city, we could get more for what we traded. There were about 1 million people living in Kyiv at that time. Lots of people went on hiking trips to trade for food like us. Villagers closer to the capital were getting spoiled and wouldn't trade much food for things anymore. The Germans were really scared of the revolting partisans. Our mother had warned us that we should never swear off the main road to Kyiv, since the Germans put landmines in practically all side roads leading up to the city. Me and my brother survived thanks to what our mother told us. Most of the time, we ended up spending in our apartment because we were terrified of the German Nazis. While we still had notebooks, we liked drawing in them to fill the time. Most of the stuff we drew was themed around the war and fighting. Me and my brother would split a piece of paper in half. One half for the German army and the other half for the Red Army. We had long arguments about who would play for the Germans since neither of us really wanted. We drew guns, jets, tanks, how it all explodes and destroys the Germans. In the end, the Red Army always won. When winter came and it got cold, we ran out of things to burn in the furnace and we had to start throwing in chairs, tables, and any wood around the house that could burn. In the end, we started burning books, papers, and those notebooks we drew in. We had no paper left to play with my brother, but we had a huge window in our apartment that we ended up drawing in and playing with instead. Once we were done playing, we'd go to bed as early as possible because we'd always be hungry and asking our mother for food. She'd ask us to go to bed sooner, saying we wouldn't feel hungry if we fell asleep. The next morning, we'd wake up and use a wet cloth to wipe the window clean so we can start over with our games. That's how we spent most of our time as kids and entertained ourselves. It was a hard life, but at least until the year 1943, we had all stayed alive. We stopped hearing from our father for a while then. We got the news that the Red Army is approaching Kyiv to try and liberate it. Once the big fight started, German and Red Army forces started bombing the city with all their might. A bomb exploded in our apartment building. We all got injured, including our then 3-year-old younger brother. We searched everywhere but couldn't find him in the rubble. We believed the bomb must have basically blown him into pieces, since there was no trace left of him. Our mother was focused on finding her children that were still alive. A shrapnel hit me in the chest. I was just 7 years old at that time. I was practically skin and bones, so the force of impact threw me off my feet and I fell on my back. While I was falling, a second shard hit me in my right hip and another one hit me in my foot. Once I was on the ground, a shell exploded near me and I got a strong concussion and became deaf in one ear. We got so badly hurt because we didn't know that we were not supposed to run anywhere when there are bombs falling from the sky. But as living beings, we had an instinct to run, thinking that would save us from this war. But what we were really supposed to do was get on the ground and hope that Mother Earth will protect us. We didn't know how to act, and so we got hurt. I got injured, and my brother got injured from a shell exploding right next to him as well. He became almost completely blind and deaf. My mother had no reaction. All she was focused on was saving her children that were still alive, and she did everything in her ability to do that. She couldn't think about anything else at that time. It was a critical moment, and she had to act immediately. It was a question of life or death. Either her children were dead or alive, and so I never saw her express any emotions when it all happened. She ripped her underskirt, made something that looked like bandages and put it under my coat, pressing down on my chest. She told me to hold it tight and not to let go to stop the bleeding. She put one bandage on my chest and another on my hip. Once the fighting calmed down, I was taken to a hospital. My brother was taken to a hospital as well, and later in 1944, he got his disability certificate. He begged us not to call him disabled or handicapped, because after the war, there were a lot of people like that, and they were not always treated the best. For example, when you'd go to a local market, disabled or handicapped people would usually line up in public areas and beg for money. A disabled sailor would put his hat on the ground, a tank man would put his helmet down, and people would throw cash to help them. People knew these disabled people fought the war and couldn't work because of their disabilities, even if they wanted. They were the poorest and most miserable people. If they did get payouts from the government, they were small and it wasn't enough to live. So they begged people for help. From such hopelessness, they would spend most of what they earned on alcohol. The word disabled became a bad word. People would use it to make fun of people or to curse at someone. My brother asked us never to call him disabled so that no one could ever find out about his disabilities. I would like to first of all remember the past. We ended up becoming victims of war when we were just 5 years old. We saw how Germans entered Kyiv, we saw how they bombed Kyiv, we saw the horrible catastrophes that occurred. It was very hard to survive that time, but we won the war and peace prevailed. I just wish that my grandchildren and their grandchildren never had to go through what I had to go through. I want them to live in peace and prosperity. I wish they will live a simple, normal human life. Yes, I am happy. I am happy that I have wonderful children whom I raised well and who got to have a good education. I am happy I have 3 grandchildren that are also wonderful. They looked up to our generation and learned from our mistakes, and I hope they will get to live a wonderful and peaceful life.
Что я хочу им сказать? Чтобы они долго жили, счастливо жили, вот, и не тужили, вот, и не тужили.